Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi! This episode is about transitioning from hybrid to flexible working with a comprehensive systems approach. Fixed or structured hybrid working models are an interim step on our journey adapting for the future of work and its tech-based and Gen AI-boosted evolutions. We have been gathering understanding about new work options that can give our businesses critical operational flexibility and improve employees' experiences and performance. Workplace flexibility is one core dimension of the multifaceted modern work landscape that we are adapting to in fits, starts, and occasional leaps. The fuller picture encompasses many interdependent organizational and operational aspects, including a stronger culture, flatter hierarchy, shifted mindsets, updated workflows, continuous upskilling, non-linear careers, and a more blended workforce. System thinking helps bring a logical, dispassionate approach when designing the appropriate framework for your organization and integrating flexibility pervasively so your business and workforce can innovate and keep adapting as necessary for ongoing shifts, updates, and transitions. I'm delighted to be speaking with Denise Brouder, founder and head of data and insights at Sway Workplace, a professional training and coaching firm that specializes in delivering mastery in flexibility at work at scale. Denise is a flexible work skills expert, researcher, speaker, and consultant with a strong background on Wall Street working in financial oversight and controls, mitigating and managing risk. She now helps organizations optimize performance through flexibility, using the science of flexibility and behavioral change. Hi, Denise. How are you?
Hey, Sophie. How you doing?
I am well. We start with Limerick. Back in Ireland, you studied business at university?
Yeah, University of Limerick in the west of Ireland, which is where I grew up. I studied finance and economics, but I've been in the US. After university, I came to New York. I had this dream of making it to Wall Street, but I'm living in this tiny rural town in the west of Ireland with not a tremendous amount of resources. So just being my cheeky self, in my last year at university, I emailed all the big banks in New York, and one wrote back and said they'd give me an internship.
Why the US, though? Why Limerick to New York?
So, well, New York and Wall Street is the epicenter of finance. I mean, that's all I could see getting to Wall Street. It's all I wanted to do is to experience that and grow a career there. So it was Limerick was the next step was Wall Street.
And so you wrote to them and they wrote back?
So cheeky. I just wrote and said, any chance. So they wrote back and gave me an internship. I went on to my bank on campus and I took out a loan for £300 at the time and I booked a one-way ticket to New York.
So you worked for Merrill for 3 years and you got into oversight and controls. Why that particular area?
It just seemed a natural jumping point. I'm very systems oriented and I love to understand how things work. So operations for me was the business of how the business worked. And finance is about how capital and cash flows and moves around. So those two things came together in my time at Merrill Lynch. And then I jumped over to Goldman Sachs for a number of years as well, with the same kind of a workflow, which was finance and economics and operations. Just understanding like how the whole industry of Wall Street comes together. I found it fascinating.
And how differently did those two firms operate? As you're deep in the nerve center of how these companies are actually running.
In a compare contrast, like in my time there, Merrill Lynch was a very traditional kind of blue chip Wall Street bank. When I went to Goldman, people I think from the outside would look at Goldman and say it's an incredible, crazy culture, extremely hard work. It was all those things, but I found Goldman to have a very flat organization, which means I could reach up very easily and speak to or be mentored by people 2 or 3 levels above me. I found it very flat and very easy to move around. And I mean, I absolutely loved my time there. Loved it.
Why then the move to innovative technologies? Was that to take yourself up a level with a view to going where?
So after about 10 years on Wall Street, I moved into the startup world. Honestly, the move initially was to do with flexibility. So it has come full circle. And, I think that, 50% of more of the working population are females, that at some point, some females most do become mothers, and I just become a young mother.
Wall Street is not very helpful.
It's not, regard. It's not very flexible. And you have to make you'd make this impossible decision about how you want to live your life and your family life and your work life. And that's what kind of propelled me into the startup world on the back of needing and require for flexibility. But I also just love being small fish or big fish in a small pond and kind of just starting from day zero with a problem and building something. I find that process fascinating. I'm addicted to it.
How small was Nevada at the time?
Nevada was a team of about 20 to 30 people. And it grew to, raise a Series A and we kind of doubled, tripled staff. It was in the energy field, the energy sector, and we did really well as a startup company. It did make it in the end, but it was a great run while I was there.
Fascinating, though, to go from a company, I think Goldman was probably 30,000 people at the time, and going from 30,000 to 30. How was that? It's such a different mindset of the people. It's such a different culture. It's not just being flexible about your life, but everything about how you work and how you operate and how you think has to be flexible in a startup.
I think when you're in a large company like a Goldman Sachs, as much as I loved it, at some point it becomes somewhat transactional and you are, you're seeing only a very small piece of the bigger org. But when you're in a startup company, your everyday effort is determining where the ship goes. It's so transparent, your work effort, and it's in the achievement that you feel when things go right. It's such a high. It's like a startup high. So it is completely different. But I discovered that I had this dual personality. I could operate very well in a large, structured, complex org, and the different dimension of me would operate quite differently in a startup organization, which I just flourished in.
And so were you then responsible for putting processes in place? Because at 30, it's just starting to get the processes in place during that growth period.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. You're encountering problems, you're bringing on more customers, you're understanding their need. And a lot of times, when you're in a startup, you're hustling. You are in hustle mode. And it's like, sure, I can get that to you by next week. And you're like, and then you figure it out. You build something around that, you ship it, you deliver it, you test it, you iterate, get feedback, and go. Right. So it's that kind of mentality of being very close to your customers and the market and the overall business outcome.
Which is harder from the controller point of view. I was doing strategic development when I worked in those kind of startups, when you're the one who's pushing, but knowing how you're stressing the back end, but you are also understanding both, but having to keep the wheels on the road.
You want to keep it afloat. And the other thing I found really interesting, Sophie, is trying to build and scale something with limited resources. Sometimes I think when you're too early and you get a lot of money, it can be a little distracting. But when you're really resource conscious, you are finding and you're operating so lean and you're finding and bartering favors with people to get things online. It's a different kind of a stretch mentally, intellectually that you have to do. It's a different kind of muscle that you're building.
Then you go to LugTrack.
Yes.
I have to say, it's not a name that flows incredibly well. You stayed there a long time and did a lot of different things for them. So why was that the next step for you?
So I moved over to LugTrack because I'd worked with somebody at Noveda that moved over to start this company. And because I had a finance and ops background, he tapped me to come join him. So we were a 5-person team that started with a patent. Okay. Literally, we started with a piece of paper. And the piece of paper basically said that you have the control over luggage tracking technology. So we created and that was right before that whole industry started taking off. So we had a patent on a particular way of tracking you having a device in one hand, your phone and app in the other. So you could track your luggage real time anywhere in the world. So we, as a team of 5, started with this patent. We spun up manufacturing in China. We developed partnerships with AT&T, with Tumi, and with Samsung, some of the biggest players in the world.
Nice.
As a team of 5 people, it was outrageous what we were able to build. Because back to my point, when your resources are limited, You have to get very creative about producing value from what you have, doing the utmost with what you have. And that I learned a lot from that process.
I do think working in these startup situations, you become so much more expansive about how you approach any issue, right?
Yes, and I'd also look at that a little differently in the sense of every problem has a solution. You just have to be willing to find it. And you have to be creative about how you uncover that and have to be persistent and gritty about getting to there. And then being okay with being wrong and pivoting and taking a new direction. So those are all very much emotional skills, actually, as a startup founder, that you have to be very comfortable with. That's a big part of it.
Yes, and working out when there's enough data to show that you're probably wrong and not keep on going down that road just to prove it to yourself that you can make it work somehow.
It is so hard. It is so hard. I've learned that lesson the hard way.
So is LugTrack still around?
You might remember there was a major problem with lithium-ion batteries going on fire in airplanes. That's what really hurt us because that took the market in a very different direction. So what's wild, Sophie, is that every startup founder will tell you that you can have the greatest idea in the world, but if your timing is not right, your timing is not right. And that was kind of our issue with that startup. We were a little too early for the mass market with our idea because your runway is just that. It's a runway. But our runway ran out and batteries started blowing up on planes.
So you needed to have the battery in it?
Yeah, we were lithium-ion powered.
This is 2019, pre-pandemic, that you then say, okay, I'm going to do my own thing. What was it focused on? Because it wasn't focused on hybrid working so much then.
No. It was a big leap of faith. You know, it's different when you're working on a founding team. But when you are the founder, it is such a leap of faith to do so. And it's been my passion since the beginning of 2019. And in 2019, right, literally in January of that year, is when LugTrack was winding down because it was operational, as I mentioned. And I just came across the term the future of work. And at that point, the future of work had been spoken about and written about previously, but I took an online course on edX. It's an MIT Harvard collaboration. And the course was it was like a 90-day online course learning about the history of work and the future of work. And I remember so clearly being in my home office and feeling like I got hit by a light bulb. I was like, oh my God, I had this vision of this wall and a door opening into this blackness, but I knew it was signaling we had to come together and move through that door collectively into a better way of working. So that light bulb moment for me was like, wow, we are about to change everything about how we work. And in my mind, I felt so strongly that flexibility was we were on the precipice of becoming the norm, of becoming the standard. And I haven't been able to shake that feeling since. That feeling has pursued me over these last several years to really understand how to really productize a way to help people understand how to work flexibly so we can move into the future of work.
What was it about your revelation about the future of work that caused you to focus on flexibility? And then as you're growing your business, was it at that point to help people work more flexible? Because there were a lot of people who were working flexibly. A lot of it was informal. So how was that progression? And then I want to get to the pandemic, because obviously that must have been fascinating as well for you. Okay, this now changes.
Wild, right?
Yeah. How wild is that? Okay.
When I started studying the future of work, early 19, there's a lot of more flavors to it. And at that time, the big thrust around the topic was, the McKinseys of the world couldn't put out enough work papers about how AI was going to displace and reshape and reform the world of work for everyone. And I knew that, I just knew that was, which happens to be where we are today. And I remember having such a distinct feeling. I wanted to run onto the top of a hill and scream, AI is coming, AI is coming. We all have to get ready. And I say that because I have a really deep connection and a real huge feeling of empathy for the everyday person. I don't mean people that operate from a position of privilege or senior leaders in companies. I mean the everyday people that are on the line getting it done. We're in our communities, we're working, we're growing. And I just thought we're at such a disadvantage if we cannot prepare ourselves for the future of work, and we're going to be displaced if we don't get ready. Now, even saying AI, I mean, at that point, no one was talking about AI, but I knew and I felt strongly that if we could master the techniques that ensure flexible work at scale, I felt like that change was enough to create inertia that will allow us to open our minds to all other kinds of impending change. Meaning, I thought if we could flexibly, physically change the way we run our day-to-days en masse and on scale, we would be open to other forms of change and more adaptable to that and prepared for that. So we are not wholly displaced in the world of work, and we have an opportunity to propel ourselves forward and prepare for the future, not for the few that know, but for the everyday person that's in our communities, we're families and getting it done. Does that make sense?
I had more hope about that coming, but more coming through the younger folks. Just as Gen Zs now, it was millennials who were coming into the workplace with the new technologies and without legacy ways of doing things. Oh, look what we can do. We've got these powerful smartphones, we can work differently. And they already had more of a flexible mindset because that was what was logical and made sense based on these new tools that were put in their hands. So you're 1 and a bit years into this, and then the pandemic hits.
So we are a female founded and a female run company. And just like your concern is on bridging the generational divide to a big extent, our actual original social mission was to level the playing field for women at work, which really just simply meant, can we use flexibility at scale to level the playing field? Meaning, not really had no desire to give anyone an unfair advantage. I just wanted to make it a fair fight. And I thought the flexibility and believed the flexibility at scale can do such a thing. So that was kind of our original mission. So me and my teammates, we said, we're looking around us and we're running market research and we're going into big companies to talk to people about flexibility. And it's here, it's an option, but no one would ever actually take it because you would look so bad for you. So we literally got around the table one day and we're like, all right, I guess we're going to push this boulder uphill and die trying. We knew it was difficult, and it was. The first year was very difficult, trying to get an appetite and a conversation around flexibility. So our first iteration of Sway was a technology play, meaning that we were intending to lay out and design a series of kind of productivity apps and community apps to convene the conversation digitally around new ways of working, at least create a home for the conversation so that we could begin to think differently, so we could do something differently. But that's when the pandemic happened, and we're like, oh, there we go. Our biggest gating factor just got eliminated. High-fiving each other.
When I first started in 2011, it was also about the workplace flexibility. I focused on women first. And when I really started getting into it, I'm going to have to focus on everybody, and flexibility will benefit women the most, but everybody actually deserves it. But things had changed a lot by 2019.
Can I please respond to that? Because that is so important, what you just said to me, in that we originally, like I mentioned, started out as females at work, women at work. And I was studying right now, it used to be The Wing. Are you familiar with The Wing?
Yeah.
Remember that super famously? And it's traded hands. I came to The Wing way back doing our research. I looked around me and I was like, this is just all bullshit. This is just a big circular conversation. I'm like, we will never solve the issue for women and access to work by talking about women at work. Why we have to get into the system and change the system from the inside out, which means you have to make flexibility a gender neutral issue for everyone. And that was our approach. But even the more I got into it, I'm like, wow, actually, flexibility is an intelligent model of work for the modern era. It's actually got nothing to do with women at work, although it's certainly a social side benefit. Isn't it really about a productivity and an economic advantage for our economic future? And that's kind of where we've evolved to by achieving our original message. It's wild, right?
Yes, exactly. I have looked very deeply at that exact point, which was really proven by the pandemic, that the only way that we can actually adjust sufficiently and adapt and pivot as we need in this technology-driven, unpredictable, fast-moving world is to have that flexibility. In the pandemic, with the needs to pivot, the companies that had already been integrating new ways of working, decentralizing decision-making, all those type of things, were able to adjust much more easily. The science of flexibility. What does that mean for you? What is the science of flexibility?
So I'll go back to my point earlier that I'm a bit of a dork in the way that I approach everything as a system. I didn't even really know I was a systems thinker until I met systems thinkers. I was like, "Oh, can you say that again? I think I know exactly what you're saying." And they
And this
taught
is
me
very much a systems problem. Yes.
this is completely a systems problem. And systems also take the emotion out of it. So you're not thinking, you're not acting on instinct or a reaction
Yeah.
or gut feeling. It's like, how does this actually work? What are the
Mm-hmm.
information flows? What are the communication flows? What are the capital flows? And let's make a better decision based on a system. So for me, all of our work, although I don't talk about systems in our day-to-day work because nobody wants to hear that. I mean, it's foreign to a lot of people, but it's how we're wired. And it's how all of our output at Sway is wired. But I did create a science of flexibility, almost like a way to talk to senior leaders about it. And the reason I did that is because as much as I feel a very close emotional connection to the outcome of flexibility at scale, that does not help de-risk an operational strategy for a large company.
Sure.
I've said the same thing two very different ways. So I guess my background actually in the corporate world at Goldman Sachs, Merrill Lynch, taught me early on how to be wired like a de-risker.
Yes.
Right? So the science of flexibility is my way to hand something or communicate to senior leaders that are really accountable for performance within a flexible model and help them close their blind spots. Because, we can't just bang on the table and say, I want flexibility. We have to kind of demonstrate, well, how does it work? Why is it better than the way previously? How do we measure the impact? And how do we deploy it? So It's almost like a risk-adjusted talent model. And we explain all this in a condensed, easy-to-consume setting under the umbrella term, the science of flexibility. And it's specifically for senior leaders to get a group of people on the same page.
Risk-adjusted talent model. I like
Yeah.
that. Great jargon. You know what I mean? I say that very respectfully, honestly.
Of course.
I think one of the challenges for me for a long time has been communicating about the future of work in a way that is going to land. And that got me into empathy. So I want to talk about relational intelligence. As listeners will have heard many times, one of the things that got me into talking about empathy was about the major generational disconnect with millennials. And I looked at all the research, put myself in their shoes, and I was like, oh, so that was where it came from. And then it solved many other issues, including the decentralized workforce, which I was talking about for 2017, 2018, and the flexibility that went with that, and then seeing this mindset. So this shift that you have talked about and what that comes with new ways of working is the emotional piece of it, that psychological piece of it, which is extraordinarily tough to get through communicating why this matters with flexibility, but also in how we work. I'd love to hear your perspectives on that.
So, empathy and EQ is built into our work also, not as a core focus, but as a demonstration of the intelligence that is in flexibility, meaning it's one component of, people think of emotions and EQ. They think of this emotional kind of romantic kind of a love, but love comes in all flavors. There's love of yourself first and foremost. There's love of the people around you. There's love of nature, whatever you want to love. It is a layer of how we perceive and understand the world around us. And if you are not aware of how to regulate and or use your emotions to your advantage, others will to your disadvantage, which could be simply saying, when we are working together and we are physically apart, the rules of the game have changed. We communicate differently. And we believe at Sway that high-performing, flexible teams are fueled by empathy-based trust. Empathy-based trust. Now, we teach the techniques for how to develop that and get kind of consensus on that. But we start with empathy. And we teach some kind of coaching models for how to understand what empathy is and how do you actually act empathetically towards others, but not because I want to be in favor with somebody else, but because it's a source of intelligence. And in an AI-influenced world, where a lot of our work is going to be transformed and lifted, we are left with the work of being human to one another. And if we can actually find the greatest thing we're ever born with, our sense of intuition, ideation, creativity, and instinct. We are all born with that gift, but it's oftentimes clouded out of us. But in an AI-influenced world, you're going to get paid to tap into that level of emotional intelligence and produce from that point. And that's new news. Welcome news, in my point of view, but new news.
I'd say so many of those things. Basically, we need to learn to be more human, right? The human genius, the specific genius that we have is that non-incremental thought, that inspirational thought that comes from and is supported and encouraged and stimulated by environments where there is much more emotional connection and that relational intelligence that you're talking about. And we have to get much better at it. We have been so much more like machines in the past, and we have to put that aside and say the machines are great at that. Let's let them get on with it. And they're really good at it. And now we have to be so much more human. How do you think we're doing so far?
Look at it's early on, and even for me, and I've been studying this for quite some time, and I always catch myself when I get angry at somebody driving on the road. But an emotion is energy in motion, emotion. Energy in motion. It's our natural response that we often feel in our physical body. It's like, when you get bad news, you're like, oh, you feel queasy. Or you get a bad email at work and you get a pain in your back. We feel emotions in our body. Then as the other side of physical intelligence is the other major dashboard of things that we need to start paying attention to develop a competitive advantage in the way that we work. So like these things we've talked about in the last 60 seconds is fundamental to our human design, but we're only beginning to get comfortable at looking at that now. And that's why our big push is standardization around the language and approach of understanding this so we can understand this as a workplace tool, not as something you pick up in a self-help aisle in Barnes & Noble. It's actually quite different. And again, it underpins this is this rush of AI. We are being called to do this. This is what's going to make us employable, not in the far future, but in the near future. So it's early on, but we have all that in front of us if we are willing to open our mind, change, and adapt.
Empathy-based trust. Yeah. We've got some trust issues in the workplace now, I think, which I do see as being a big issue. Coming out of the pandemic, there's been a lot of confusion where work models going to end up. And I knew it was going to be challenging because it's hard to get hybrid working. People then did have their own epiphanies during the pandemic. Reflection changed how people have been reacting. We find that whatever hybrid model most companies, say in the US, have decided upon for now, there doesn't seem to be a connection, a trust-based connection that is actually helping employees comply with those mandates. If I think you actually might change the model, why would I come in? Are you following my keyboard strokes? How do you see where we are, why we are here from your perspective, and how we can change them?
So it's a good way to put it into framing of where we've come from, where we were, where we've just come from, and where we are. And I think that in the traditional way of working, we just evolved our norms around this sense of visual-based trust. Obviously, I trusted you because I saw you. Even though you may have been playing, Pac-Man at your computer, or Tetris, or whatever you were doing, and I couldn't see your screen, but you were here. And that's that visual line of sight created a layer of trust that we all understood that's how it works. When we were all shifted home for fully remote work, it was a very uncomfortable period of time. And I think a lot of leaders found themselves on teams. Do we actually trust each other? Was it ever really trust if it was required and that we see each other? But, we shifted into that kind of this period of time where it was a lot more kind of monitoring based, where whether it was kind of looking at keystrokes or a leadership team spinning up a dashboard to determine if people were logging in on their phone or logging in on their computer and looking for all these data points to prove or disprove the level of trust. And I've been in rooms in our work with Sway where, my God, Sophie, people like literally would say, even though we are working in a hybrid fashion now, I've never felt less trust and less flexibility than ever before because there was such this oversight that was encroaching without articulation for why and how the data was being used. And look, those are growing pains, but we are shifting into what I think we can only make flexibility work at scale and en masse if we move towards empathy-based trust. But the interesting thing about trust, Sophie, is that it is a two-way street. And it has to come from both sides. And I think that I'll give you a good example. Just last week, I was speaking with a leader of a small SMB in the defense industry who was kind of recounting to me that she felt that her teams were more than happy to let teams work flexibly with some degree of kind of coming together for potential important clients. But the few asks that leader had is if you're out or you cannot be online, just put it on your calendar. But the person in this particular case, as an example, wasn't doing that. So the other person wasn't holding up their end of the bargain. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have that level of respect for one another along these clear channels of expectations and communications, we cannot develop empathy-based trust or trust to begin with. So I think that a big shift, Sophie, is that there is this high level of personal responsibility that exists on the worker who is embracing and wants flexibility to adjust their work style when they're not in an office setting to match and meet the expectations of what the employer needs, meaning it has to be in the middle, is consensus on the middle to demonstrate and signal trust back and forth.
Yes. They shouldn't need to be saying when they're not at their desk. If it's outcomes based, that's where the trust needs to focus. I do actually believe that there was very little trust beforehand. Perhaps the trust was created back in the 50s and 60s, where the trust was between the organization and the employee because there was lifelong employment. So there wasn't actually necessarily trust between leaders and employees. It was based on the fact that I am looked after. That's the reciprocal arrangement. I am looked after by the organization, and that's the loyalty and trust. But they weren't treated very well. So I don't think there has been great trust. I think there have been rules and behaviors and routines. Potentially the pandemic stripped those away. And whilst we got raw and real and could see into people's homes and the tragedies and all the rest of it, that changed the empathy, that changed the trust under force of situation. And then now we go to a different environment. And I do think how that trust can then be established, not even reestablished, I don't think, but established for the first time, takes a lot of work. And it does go to the culture and the connection of the community and those relationships that I think haven't been there, moving away from that transactional aspect. I think it's a big shift.
It is a big shift. And you raise a really good point there. You know, we're talking here about is a little bit about the day-to-day trust things, the signals we send to each other, like whether trust exists or how we wrote it. But your point earlier is there is a bigger shift at play when you're mentioning about the social contract that has stood the test of time since we invented, the way at our workday back in the early 1900s. And that social contract counted for a lot. It was stability, durability, sense of financial safety that has eroded significantly. So there is these bigger calls for reimagining the social contract, especially like with the evolution of the freelancer model and these other even bigger than flexibility trends that are happening around us are completely remaking what it means for in our minds to actually, to trust the system. Like, what is the system?
And the system is going to be more of a fabric. I'm talking to Gary Bowles. He talks about a work net and that extended talent pool. And there are lots of different ways to be thinking about this, but I do see it very much as a fabric of interconnected companies, which is all flexible for the employer and flexible for the employee / non-employee / fractional employee freelancer. I think we've got a long way to go so that it works for everyone. And at the same time, empathy and trust must be key in that, which can be built up most probably, I think, by outcomes, by performance, which is how freelancers and contractors work successfully at this point. What do you see as happening this year? 2023 was the first full year post-pandemic. A lot of messiness. Is hybrid going to stay? Okay, now we got there. Hybrid is going to stay. And you're now focusing very much on making hybrid work, which is not easy. Mm-hmm. So what do you see the evolution happening during this year?
So a lot of the data, like the flex folks and whatnot, and Nick Bloom will indicate a stagnation in the evolution or where we are. I don't think we're going to see much of a variation to that, if not only to the downside. And what I mean by that is I've spoken just to random people I've met over the last couple of weeks that have said, "Ooh, I think we're going to go back in 4 days. I don't know, maybe it's going to be 5. It's less about stating what number of days they think that they're going to have to do. And to me, what was flagged to me was more their willingness to go along with that, as in less of a desire to fight the good fight.
You're the only person that I've heard that says that. That's so extraordinary to me. I do not see any data that shows that that's going to happen.
Well, data is very much lagging in a lot of cases. We're getting data that's what's happened in the past. That's why I talk to as many people as I can to understand where their mindset is. And, some of these folks are more, again, this is just like a random sampling within my personal and professional orbit over the last 2 to 3 weeks, where it's come up a number of times. And I'm like, ooh, is that what you really want to do? Like, are you sure you'd want to really go back in up to 4 days, maybe even 5? Like, well, if they ask me, I'm just going to have to do it. I'm like, wow, where's our fight? Where's our willingness to stand up for and against? So I do worry, Sophie, when we think about kind of trends. It's just one little thread I'm watching. It's one little thread.
I'm very curious about that. I don't see that happening at all because there's so little compliance with the mandates that are out there. Looking at the Conference Board data, which said that 4% of CEOs are prioritizing return to work this year, and Nick Bloom's data that CEOs and CFOs anticipate hybrid working levels at the same level in 2028. The same as this year. It makes me feel that there's still going to be a lack of commitment to actually trying to make this work, which means it's going to be just as messy as last year. For me, it's not about fighting. It's about actually getting to a place which makes sense for how we're doing business. And so it's not helpful to go back to these rigid ways of working. It's just not helpful for the businesses. That's the key for me.
Oh Lord, not at all. It's not helpful for, I don't see, it's not a long-term model. In office, an in-office model of work is not suitable for where we need to grow economically, regardless of where your industry is. It just isn't. But my point earlier is I was just a little alarmed by this random sampling of people that were just acquiescing to, I'm just going to go along with it. However, large-scale wholesale, there's other people I know that have pretty solid levels of flexibility. But Sophie, to be honest, that's kind of very short term. I still think, I don't know, short term I still think is still kind of a very malleable situation. However,
messy.
It's a little messy, but in the face of like the big things like we're talking about, like disruption of AI and the move towards freelancing as a model and all these other kind of trends, my goal is to, in the face of all of that, really articulate the value and flexibility, not as a perk or a fad or something we did, but as, like, to repeat it again, to me, it is an intelligent model of work for the modern era, for the modern worker. And for those companies that are willing to embrace that and swallow that whole and have a willingness to adapt to a new way of working, which is beyond deciding what level of flexibility is and more about, how do we adjust our work practices? That includes empathy, that includes emotional intelligence, among other things, to create a new way of working. Like, those are the folks that we focus on and that we have the best success with. The rest, my hope is that pendulum, they're going to come along.
I don't think they have a choice. I think it is very much a mindset. I've been saying for years that workplace flexibility is a mindset first before it's a policy. And it can be very hard to change your mindset. And when so many other things are changing, it's just where you necessarily want to be.
We all believe that. And I think that the bridge we have to build is it's not enough to say it. We just have to do it.
Yeah. Coming from workplace flexibility way before the pandemic, from societal perspectives as well, households economically needing to have two working parents, and they needed flexibility. So there were some really obvious things that were needed on that basis. And then looking at the pivots that we had during the pandemic, if we need to keep pivoting, it's very hard to have fixed mindsets about how we work and yet have a completely flexible mindset to be thinking about how to enable the business to be successful.
So our facilitators this way, they're all career coaches by training. So the folks that have been previously in the corporate world, so they speak the language of our clients. And then for whatever personal reasons, they became a career coach because honestly, mindset is the first thing we touch every single time. We use coaching models, life models to help people develop a sense of resiliency and adaptability before we even talk about anything else. One thing, a model that we use is the model called the Empowered Mind model. Are you familiar with that? Based on the space between, it's a way for tactically to develop empathy and convert that into EQ. The idea is to help people in its practice understand in what situation and how do I actually respond to something instead of react. And that is a huge leap. There's a million use cases you could get for that. But what underpins that is a sense of resiliency, which is this positive outlook on forward momentum in the face of change. Because, Sophie, as you and I know well, having studied the space for some time, it's not necessarily change that we have to be concerned about. It's the rate of change. The rate of change is, it's almost exponential.
I hadn't thought about that, the stepping back from judgments, stepping back from making assumptions or reacting in a way that one would normally do as being resilience or being useful to help with one's resilience in light of the changes one has to go through. Interesting.
That's the crux of it. I mean, if we want to work differently, we have to think differently. Mm-hmm. And if we want to think differently, I think we start with resiliency.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you're less threatened by it, and you look at it more as an opportunity. It really comes down to, Sophie, I think all of this is, what do you see? Like, what do you see in front of you when you look at this? We're all looking at the exact same thing and seeing completely different things.
Completely different things. Oh, absolutely. Yes.
It's wild. And, it's just getting to more consensus on what we see through using these language models.
And that really is where I think there is such a disconnect, let's just say across generations. The key thing for me about the youngest generation who have so little baggage or legacy understanding of how we were working is that they can help us really see how things are. They can't necessarily experience it in the same way or bring us enormous amounts of intelligence to show us how to change because they can't bridge the gap. So I do really see it as being the blind leading the blind a little bit right now, but hey.
And I think that we used to, traditional way of work, I mean, the American way of working that I could see so clearly because I came from Europe to the US. And I saw such a huge cultural difference. In the US, work. But to me, I think when I looked over kind of all of the work we've done, it's like the older generations, of which I am one, I'm Gen X, has always associated a hard day's work with a sense of kind of decency and almost patriotism in some way, and honor.
It's the Calvinist doctrine.
And I think that when the older generations look at the younger ones looking to reach those outcomes in a different way, being more technology savvy and advanced and efficient, they have a hard time associating value with that style of work. And I think that's one of the things we try to address is, hey, it's a new way to do it.
It is in the Calvinist documents that says you have to suffer in your work in order to go to heaven. There's a lot of religious connection with working hard and giving back and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
So we can focus it, like if you're getting stuff done, if you're actually making things happen. And
it's a lot of rewiring. So going back to your point on mindset, there's a lot of rewiring that has to happen.
For leaders within large companies, if they really do see the value of more flexible ways of working, of trying to make that transition, trying to take that on board and bring that into their organization, how can they start with their own team, with their own department, to start making changes in how they're approaching their work, the way things are organized and operating?
There's a couple of core things that you could begin to look at. I guess the first point I want to make is what you mentioned earlier about the fact that, we see it a little differently in the sense that the future of work is a journey, not a destination. And I think that framing is so important because, in this hyper-connected, oodles of pressure world that everyone lives under, particularly those leading teams of people, they feel they have to complete it, check the box and move on. But the reality is this evolution and change will always be an iteration. So I think one is to give somebody as a leader grace to step back and say, okay, this is not something I'm going to complete. This is something that's going to evolve and I'm going to work on over, like Play-Doh. We're just going to continue to mold it and go over time. The other thing to kind of think about is that in a world where we're working flexibly, and again, I use the word flexible now. Last year we used hybrid. We don't use that word anymore because we always felt that it was a signpost towards flexibility. So we only speak in the language of flexibility. Is to understand that in this new way of working, we don't kind of learn and communicate observationally. We do so through documentation. And to do so, we have to be explicit about the things we didn't have to before. And that could be very simply how the expectation of when you're going to respond to an email versus Slack message. Yeah. Something as simple as that can save an enormous amount of time and somebody spinning their wheels. I think the other thing to really think about, Sophie, there's many aspects to this. But the other thing is that I want to pick up on your point about leading by outcomes. And we all know that we do value the outcome. That's what we measure too. I don't necessarily know as a leader if it's enough to say, I'm only going to lead by outcomes. I think that you cannot meet your team at the finish line because somebody might have tripped up the road. So I think
sure.
that
Yes.
what I mean is not necessarily as a departure from the traditional kind of KPI and metrics and nice neat boxes. I think that there is a huge value in a leader becoming more on the human side and knowing their teams in different ways. Because we create a social space to know different aspects of our team's personality, not necessarily anything personal, but their work styles and stuff like that, we can begin to develop a relationship at distance. That's not required to be physically together, but can be equally supportive in a different way. So there's just dropping these kind of bits of kind of ways of thinking in to really demonstrate it is a new way of thinking before we can implement sticky norms, habits, and behaviors that are the structure, order, and routine that every flexible team needs to thrive in the future of our work.
Wonderfully put. It's been such a pleasure, Denise, to go through all this stuff. It's really so interesting to follow your journey and how your evolution, coming with a very strong grounding in large organizations on Wall Street, and then evolving to where you are now and being able to take on the not enviable task of trying to help large organizations that have very structured ways of doing things and bringing them into a much more flexible realm.
That's why I reoriented my approach, because last year was difficult because I'm walking into firestorms because hybrid to one person is hybrid to something else. And I'm trying to build consensus. So I've developed a thick armor around it. But it's my passion for it that really, really kind of propels me forward.
I agree. I feel the same. Well, Denise, from passion to passion, I really, really appreciate speaking to you. And I'm so thankful for you sharing all that you have, and all the stuff will be in the show notes. Thank you so much, Denise. Really appreciate it.
I don't want to hang up. This is too much fun, Sophie.
Thanks again so much to Denise Brouder, founder and head of data and insights at Sway Workplace. You can follow Denise on LinkedIn and on X and Instagram at Sway Workplace, SWAY Workplace, and Sway's website, swayworkplace.com. Immediate action tip. First, the future of work is a journey, not a destination. Take the pressure off completing the transition as it is an evolution. Second, we learn and communicate new ways of working through documentation rather than observation. Third, lead by outcomes. And finally, create social space to learn team members' work styles. To find out more about how empathy and a human-centric approach requires and supports flexibility at work, you can check out my second book, Empathy Works, The Key to Competitive Advantage in the New Era of Work. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. And you could even write a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated, useful articles, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.